Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. I am your lovable host, Jeremy Shear, and I have with me two of the best. Michael Birchfield, a Conversa producer who is masterful at working with all of our clients. Hello, Michael. Welcome to this episode.
Hey, Jeremy, thanks for having me on.
And we have with us also Josh Hale, our celebrated head of production, who is here. And I'm assuming, Josh, extremely excited to be part of this episode.
Always am. That's why I'm a producer, is because I love to be on the show. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And not behind the scenes. I
Yeah.
love this part.
I mean, you are living your dream right now.
Exactly. Camera
It's
right in
not,
my
it's all
face.
downhill from here. It will not get better than this. So I wanted to bring you guys on because I've been doing some of these episodes just solo as monologues, which I think is just not nearly as fun and doesn't make for as good content. And because I wanted to talk about something that I think we're all interested in, we've all been kind of talking about already, which is scripted narrative podcasts. And just for our listeners to give a little context here. So most of the shows that we produce, not most, all of the shows that we currently produce for our clients are interview style podcasts, which is fine, which is great. An interview podcast can be really, really good and engaging when done well. But I'm a big fan of what we're calling scripted narrative podcast. And for those who don't know that terminology, it means podcast that's not just interview format. It has a narrator who's performing a voiceover script. And then that's combined with sound bites from an interview. And it's used to tell kind of a more complex narrative, a story. And, I'm thinking of popular podcasts like How I Built This, and many, many others like it that use that kind of scripted narrative framework. And that's
Like
just been on
I
my
think
mind.
for
Yeah, go ahead,
sorry.
Josh.
I think for someone that is not super familiar with those types of podcasts, maybe they're not a podcast listener, but they know that their company is interested in podcasts, or they've seen some sort of statistic that's like, you need to make a podcast now. um, Something that is really easy to think about is just think of your local news station and how they present story by story, especially when they're like, all right, we're this person X has the story for us, and you hear this kind of overdubbed uh, narrative telling the story, the news story, from the beginning to the end, and usually you have interviews within. So like if a car crashed into a building or something like that, you'd be like, you'd hear them say, a car uh, ran off the road on Main Street today, and then you'd see a clip of someone that was at the scene being like, yo, that car just came out of nowhere, right? It-
Right.
if you think of how that is built, that's a very simple way to think of these narrative podcasts
Yeah.
on a very basic level.
Yeah. Sort of combine like a presenter telling the story combined with sound bites or like reactions from other people. And in the news, there's kind of a style of doing that.
Yeah,
And the style that we're talking about is a little bit different because we're not reporting breaking news, obviously, but the
exactly.
format is very similar. You're right. And so, what I want to talk about today mainly is kind of the pros and cons of this style of podcast storytelling for B2B brands. And to start off with, just kind of a basic question, why do we think that B2B brands should consider doing scripted narrative podcasts either instead of interview podcast or, alongside doing an interview podcast? So I'm just going to throw that out there. I'd love to hear, what you guys think. Like, Michael, let's start from you.
It definitely helps you form your focus more. So it definitely helps you get to the meat of the conversation and get across the point that you're going for in the beginning, even if you weren't able to do that in the interview. You're able to use those clips from the interview and better form the point that you're trying to get to, the idea or product you're trying to get across, or the business that you're interviewing, like your company, for the company that you're interviewing for.
So
Uh,
let me ask you, like, what do you mean by that? You're better able to do those things? 'Cause you can do that in an interview podcast as well.
Correct. And that is It can be harder to do when you're one-on-one with somebody because the conversation can divert a little bit and go down different paths. This way, you're able to do that interview without using a lot of the guest time to go back, reassess the whole thing, and find out if that's really the direction you were looking to take, and hit the path that you're trying to go towards. And then also, it makes it more engaging. It keeps
Hmm.
you listening because you're constantly changing the audio type. So you've got yourself starting up front with this scripted narrative, and then going into these little excerpts from inside of the podcast to really take that point and hammer it home.
Hmm. I mean, yeah, like I agree. And to my mind, one of the big advantages of having the scripted part is that through the script, you can kind of better control the shape of the narrative. You can give it more like a traditional beginning, middle, and end because you're writing that. You're not just kind of beholden to how the interview went, or like where the guest kind of took things, which can be a little meandering. Writing a script, you're doing more of the traditional storytelling, starting at point A, taking it through to the conclusion. Josh, what do you think?
I mean, my point is that people love stories, and it's shown with data. When people are talking about podcasts kind of on a very broad sense, one of the first ones that come to their mind are true crime, like podcasts, maybe like Serial, things like that. These are podcasts that your average person will listen to versus like an interview podcast. They just seem to be more popular. More people want to listen to these types of podcasts. So just the numbers themselves kind of speak for it. Is
Hmm.
more people are going to be interested in a story arc than they are in, all right, uh what what kind of or I don't know, just some random conversation that you're having with one of your clients that you're having to kind of like dig out bullet points for. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that the number one podcast in the world, which I believe is still the Joe Rogan Experience,
Hmm.
is an interview podcast.
It
And not
is.
just that, but it's like, 3-hour interviews. And so it's, I think we just need to recognize there are plenty of really, really popular podcasts, even the number one, that's strictly interview style. So it's certainly not that in every case a
Well,
scripted narrative
it depends
podcast is
on.
gonna, like, beat out an interview podcast.
I was just gonna say, I think it depends on how you like, aggregate those listens, though. Joe Rogan puts out an episode like every week, more than once a week, right? But these scripted narrative shows, they don't put out episodes as often, and they get put out in seasons. So I would still argue that more people are familiar with a NPR style or serial style show, or have listened to one than has listened to Joe Rogan. But yes, Joe Rogan has more listens overall because he can pump out an interview more than once a week versus there's so much more work involved in the narrative style.
Yeah, and we're gonna get into that, but Michael, go ahead. What do you wanna say?
I also wanted to just point out that it doesn't matter how long the podcast is. People don't really try look at a podcast and say, "Oh, this is 3 hours long. I don't think I'm going to listen to it." If people are moving, it's a podcast, it's an audio format. They can listen to it anywhere, whenever they want. They
Yeah.
can stop it, pick it up. So I don't think that how long a podcast really makes a difference um, in the overall. You know.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I think that applies both to interview podcast and scripted narrative podcasts, right? It's more that if you're interested in the topic, then you'll listen as long as you want to, and if you're not interested, it doesn't matter how long it is, you just won't listen. So that is definitely true. So now going back to what Josh said just before, you make a good point, right? And this gets to one of the major differences in producing these kind of podcasts. The reason why interview podcasts are so popular, are so prevalent is because they're pretty simple to produce. You
Yeah.
just have two people talking and that's pretty much it, you know? and you just need to record that and, do some basic editing,
And for
and
those
you can
top
just kind of pump
podcasts,
those out.
yeah, and for
Yeah.
those top podcasts, like you're talking about Joe Rogan, they don't even edit them, right? So
Yeah.
some hosts have just gotten to the point where they just hop on, they're ready to go, they do the interview, and they're like, all right, cut, like let's
Yeah.
put it up. There's a lot less work that goes into one of those than a scripted narrative where it
Yeah.
requires possibly multiple interviews, right? It requires a day of doing overdubs for the narration, and then someone has to go in and construct this whole thing. And to really hammer home these stories, music is going to be so important. And
Hmm.
that takes a long time to pick out the music and put it where it needs to be, assuming you're not even like some of the, highest budget shows will have original music written for the
Hmm.
show. Which adds a whole nother layer of production to it. So,
Yeah. And, of course, a B2B brand that wanted to get into scripted narrative podcasting wouldn't have to compose original music,
right.
not necessarily. But,
Unless they want us to. I mean, we.
well, I mean, you could, but it's not like it's required,
Right,
for this
exactly.
style of podcast. And but you're making some good points here. Like we said before, I think the probably the major reason that the vast majority of B2B brands are doing scripted narrative podcasts, those that are podcasting, and that or no, I'm sorry, are doing interview style podcasts, right? And that I think there are a handful of scripted narrative podcasts done by B2B companies, but they're very rare. And I think the reason is because of what you just said, that it's just more complicated. It takes
Mhm.
a lot more time. It's more expensive if you're paying someone to do it, and you're going to end up producing overall fewer episodes just because they take more time. Right. So I can kind of understand how a B2B brand might conclude like, I is that really worth it? Let's just do a really,
Yeah.
really good interview style podcast and we'll get the same benefit. But I would argue, and this goes back to what we were saying before, that a really well done scripted narrative podcast has distinct advantages over the interview style, like we were saying before. And one of them that I think we may not have mentioned is that you're going to stand out. It's just because it's different.
Yeah.
A lot of those interview podcasts, just because they're the same format, can kind of tend to blend together a little bit. So there can be great value in zigging when everyone else is zagging, or just doing something new
Totally.
that's going to really
Totally.
stand out and like be the first in your industry to do it. I think that's
Yeah.
where a lot of the value lies, alongside everything else we were saying, that these can be more engaging. When you're telling a story this way and using this narrative format, it can just be better content depending on how you do it.
Absolutely. I we've done a lot of interviews for B2B companies, and also I've listened to a lot of interviews outside of our, suite of shows, just to familiarize myself with what these interviews should sound like. And yeah, you're exactly right. Like they pretty much blend together over time. Like once you've
Yeah.
heard probably like 10, uh, you start to hear kind of the same questions come up, right? Um, and what ends up happening is, and I think for both interview and narrative shows, if we're trying to get to know the guest or the interviewee or whatever, I'm starting to think that maybe a focus on getting these fringe more people more on the fringe ends of society may be a breath of fresh air. I think the average interviewee is like you know has a bachelor's degree in in something, and they've done like the traditional you know look, I can rag on them because I am one of those people. I did
Sure.
the traditional thing. That's why I don't go on podcasts, and because I'm not interesting enough. But
Well,
I
but
wonder
you're
if
on
there
this
needs to be,
podcast.
yeah, but I wonder if there needs to be like a shift in focus on who is interviewed and the stories that we're telling, right? Like,
Mhm.
I just think the story of the fringe person in this industry, right, that's doing something completely different than anyone else is going to be way more engaging. And maybe, you know, maybe that particular person can't tell that story themselves, but uncovering that story, and then maybe just, probing them for answers to uh, specific questions you have about their story, and creating this arc, um, maybe the new way to tell you an interesting, actually engaging story in your industry. You know,
Mhm. Well, that's an interesting thought. I like this. Go after the fringe characters. You want
right?
like the weirdos, the maniacs, the
Exactly.
psychopaths,
They're
the
they're doing something
ex-cons.
weird out there, and whether it's good or, I mean, you know, I think we were working on a show where the host, uh, her favorite show was, I can't remember what the show was, but it was some narrative show, and she was just talking about, I loved how it didn't tell you whether what happened was good or bad. You kind of got to
Mm,
decide on your own, right? They
mhm.
just told you the story, and then you got to go discuss with everyone else that was listening to the show. What did you think about this particular event, right? That last
Right.
episode, like, um,
Mhm.
uh, there's and I think there's a lot more room in narrative shows to have those sort of discussions, um, and
Yeah, no, for
especially if
sure.
if the production approaches it in a way that is, not one sided, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I think, there's a reason why true crime podcasts are so popular.
Yeah.
Because they're dramatic and intriguing and, there's some danger to them, and they often involve fringe characters or just,
Right.
very bizarre circumstances or horrific circumstances. I mean, if it bleeds, it leads. That's the old,
Totally.
like, newspaper cliche, but it's kinda true. Um, and so you started to get into, Josh, sort of the different how you put together a scripted narrative podcast. And I want to get into that. For listeners that are kind of intrigued, I think it's important that they understand the production process and what's involved that's different from an interview style. So, like we said before, interview style, you essentially just have a host, you find the right guest, do a little prep, get in the studio, and then have a pretty free flowing discussion. You're sort of deliberately not over preparing. With a scripted narrative podcast, there's a lot more planning that goes into it. Kind of before you start, you need to have a very clear sense of what is this story that we're telling. You're not just kind of like, well, I hope it turns out to be a good story and we'll find out what the parts of it are later. It's like, no, to really make it work right from the first moment when you're choosing who kind of the main character is going to be. Like, number one, they have to have a good story to tell that's going to work in this format. I think a lot of people do,
Mhm.
if you dig hard enough, but you do have to dig for that story, which is different than, say, just kind of getting their thoughts on something like an issue. It has to be more like an anecdote, something that happened to them or something that they did or built, like that's how I
Exactly.
built This Works, right? It's
Hmm.
talking to entrepreneurs about how they built a brand. And it
Right.
obviously has an origin. It starts somewhere and then goes through all these different ups and downs, trials and tribulations. Like, that's the kind of narrative that you're looking for to build out, right?
Right.
And you need that in order to make this kind of podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, I relate it from my experience in radio, relates to me as a morning show does. So
Hmm.
with a morning show, you want to write out a script, write out a show flow of what you're going to talk about in several segments, where you're going to throw in different interviews, that kind of stuff, and you write the whole thing out, and that's just the way it goes, and you mix it up so that because it's a unique audience, some people only listen at the beginning for morning shows, some people only listen at the
Hmm.
end. So you like to mix the topics up, but you really want to just take people on a journey and give them kind of hurdles to overcome. You want to have different parts that are positive, different parts that are negative.
Yeah.
You don't want to keep it all on just one mood. You want to just continue a journey that people get engaged by.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good way of putting it. Sort of a main character going on a journey that people can identify with. And that's really, if you think about your favorite movies or novels or whatever, that's kind of the basic template for every good story you've ever consumed. And it's no different in this kind of podcast. And then now you're still doing an interview, right? So you still need a host who's going to sit down and interview the main character. But the dinner interview's like a little different than than say what we're doing right now, just kind of chopping it up and like bouncing ideas around. In this kind of interview, your goal is to capture that person's story, right? And so you're kind of got it really it's just saying, okay, tell us the story of how you did X. And along the way, you kind of guide them and ask, follow-up questions. But that's what you're going for. And again, it's in my experience, having put together a lot of these kind of podcasts, it's really important going in to already have the story kind of mapped out so that you know the highlights, the basic plot points. And so you already know the kinds of sound bites that you're going to need from the guest to kind of plug into the script, right? So you go into the interview already knowing that, and then you can even show that to the guest and be like, okay, here's how I'm planning on telling a story. And I'm kind of relying on you to help really build out these parts of the story, this, that, and the other. So the guest is informed. And then during the interview, you just make sure you get that stuff. So that's pretty different than just doing an interview podcast where you kind of want to just see what happens and let the interview go. And like, hopefully it'll, have surprising moments and all that. For scripted narrative, you're not looking for surprises so much. It's more like, we know the story. Let's get the guest to talk about his journey or her journey in a really interesting, engaging, excited way. Right.
Yeah. Another way to possibly approach it, if you have been thinking about doing something like this, or now that you're listening to this, you're like, yeah, how could I, like, here's a thought experiment. What could I do in my own industry that's similar to this? One way that I think would be good, place to start is think of like the most successful people within your industry. They're probably, famous or infamous, right? Maybe there's a specific person that is that some people really like and agree with, and other people really don't like, right?
Yeah.
Those are going to be good starting points, right? If let's say you're running a unique restaurant, like in the Houston area, right? Is there one investor or something that like invests in specific types of restaurants, or is there a particular restaurant that everyone loves but you've been to and you're like, that's kind of mid, right? Like, I don't really like their food that much. I wonder what all the hype is about, right? These kind of like interesting starting points where you can possibly then go to that person and then say, hey, I'm trying to engage our industry in your story. I'm interested to know how you got to this point,
Yeah.
and then take their kind of like cliff notes, right? Have them kind of explain, maybe, well, I started here and then we did this, and if it starts to go like, and then we had this really big setback, and then
Yeah.
it was this one lucky break that made it to where I could do this thing, and we figured out that even though our food's not that great, the particular way that we serve our customers is I think the number one, the reason why everybody comes here, right? Things like that. Now you have a story, right? You have a
Yeah.
story with ups and downs and all that good stuff. Uh, there may be times where you go to people and try and get their story, and either they don't want to tell it to you, or you know it's just not interesting. Um, uh, when I went to college for communications, we had to make stuff like this. That's like
Hmm.
every communications major has made something similar to this, and part of
Yeah.
that process is finding a story. And that's a good way to kind of start, I think,
Hmm.
uh, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, you do have to dig for the stories, like we were saying before. Um, for the last several years, I've been producing a podcast for the University of Michigan for the Jewish Studies Department. Specifically, they have something called the Frankel Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, and every year they bring in anywhere from about 15 to 20 fellows, and these are people from all over the world. And there's like a theme to the fellowship, and they're all working on research projects that are related to that theme. And my job as the producer is to tell stories about it. So we produce about 8, 9 episodes a year. And the cool challenge is, like, we're talking about academic research, the kind of stuff that for non-experts, even for experts, can be extremely dry and frankly boring, you know. But at the same time, if you approach it the right way, you can take just about anything and make it interesting if you tell it in a storytelling way, right? Assuming there's enough material there to shape into a storytelling way. So I think it's kind of both things. It's one, looking for people, main characters who have a good story to tell, and at the same time, whoever you're talking to, digging to find that story. Because I think most people have some kind of story to tell, and like for our kind of clients in the B2B world, you're a SaaS company or whatever. Um, yeah, you're looking for people in your industry who, I think it definitely helps if they're like a little more well known, or, have a bigger platform. And then there's all kinds of stories they can probably tell. How did they get to where they are today? What does that journey look like? Maybe they, did something like within the company they're at now, they increased revenue by X amount. How did they do that? What was that journey like? Every success has behind it a string of failures and ups and downs and mistakes and triumphs and all that. Let's bring it to life through storytelling. I mean, that's what you're really going for.
Absolutely.
And another really important element here that I think we haven't mentioned is that you need a script writer to make this work, right? In interview style podcasts, there's some writing involved, but it's minimal. You need to write out some questions, maybe. Some people don't even do that. You might write out a kind of, templated welcome to the show kind of thing, but that's, a template. And then afterwards, you're writing show notes and headlines, but it's pretty minimal. And really, the main content is unscripted. It's deliberately unscripted, people just talking. For this kind of thing, the script is crucially important as the framework for the whole story. And there's a particular way to write these kind of scripts that's very different than, I don't know, writing a blog post, or, writing other kinds of like marketing copy that B2B brand content marketers are used to writing. So that's another thing. Like, if you're going to get into this, you either need to have someone in-house who's a script writer and has experience writing these kind of scripts, or you have to find someone outside who knows how to do this. And what are your guys' thoughts, like, in terms of what makes a script good? What are you looking for? What are the elements you're looking for in a script writer, or, in the final product? Like, what is it that makes a script really good?
I'm gonna leave this to Michael, who has done narration work in the past. So I think
Yeah,
he
sure.
might have a good viewpoint here.
Absolutely.
So the question was, what makes a good script?
Yeah, in your opinion, yeah, what makes for a good, like, voiceover narration script?
Knowing the topic, really having someone that knows the topic and knows where you want to take the journey, like where you're trying to end up, what the goal is of that episode. Because every episode you want to have a goal. So you want to reach a certain point. You have a start, you have a finish. And you really want to have somebody that knows what they're talking about, or at least knows the content that they're talking about so that they can write it for the narrator. So it's really important to have that. And also somebody that's proven that they can write a good it's like just that you have some
Yeah.
examples of them being able to take you on a journey, get you over hurdles, keep somebody engaged. It's just important to engage people. Like the most important thing of any experience at all is engaging somebody. If you want other people to hear it, you have to keep them listening, and they want to listen for a
Mhm.
reason. So I think that's probably the most important.
Yeah, no, I agree with all the points you're making, and, one thing you said that I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but, you're writing the script for a narrator, and
Right.
now, on the one hand, like, duh, of course you are, that's obvious, but if you haven't done that before, or, like, that's a particular skill that in other words, you're writing this script for somebody to perform, not just to read and, like, think about. And
Correct.
that's a different kind of writing, in my experience, than writing a blog post where you expect your audience to just sort of read it at their own pace. A
You really have to have somebody with an imagination that can that I so for me, it's what I do when I'm writing descriptions for our regular B podcast. I know the person that's the host.
Yeah.
So in my head, I'm able to recreate that person within my thoughts and think about how they would say something, how
Mhm.
they would describe something, and then put that on paper.
Right. The script writer needs to, in a way, kind of collaborate with whoever the narrator is gonna be, right? With the host of the show, and write it in that person's voice.
I would say know them. I say knowing somebody's personality, having conversations with them, really going back and forth about it, and being able to write is very key to it because
Yeah.
otherwise you're writing from the perspective of an unknown.
Mhm.
And at that point, you may as well computer generate the voice because
Mhm.
it's probably all you're going to.
Right. Well, you need, and the other part of this, and we're kind of skipping to this now a little bit, is you need a narrator, someone who can do voiceover work. And I think it's ideal if that's the same person who interviewed the guest. So there's sort of some continuity there. Like that's how I
100%.
yeah, like that's how I built this works. The host of that
Yep.
show is Guy Raz, an NPR personality. And he does the interview with the guest and he's the narrator. And so it all kind of blends together and they're able to keep it to like two voices usually, or maybe three. And he, of course, is a professional at this. So he's really good at reading and performing a script and making it sound completely natural as though he's just talking to you, as though he's just kind of thinking out loud and talking in the moment, but actually he's reading a script. And that's a very particular skill. Um, one that it's taken me a while to get pretty good at. But, it took years. Like when I listen back to stuff like that I did years ago, I'm like, yeah, I've gotten better, thank God. Like I used to not be
Yeah.
so good at it, and it sounds wooden and a little hesitant or just too mannered. But you get better as a performer of sounding very natural, even though you are reading words off the screen.
And that's where this process gets really tricky because in the ultimate scheme of things, like the ultimate way you want to have this laid out, the perfect way is to have someone like me there with the narrator walking through every step, recording them. Because what they say in their heads, what they're hearing through their headphones isn't always, the way that it should be said.
Mhm.
So when I was recording narratives, we would go through 2 hour sessions. They would read lines. Sometimes I'd stop and be like, hey, hold on. Liked it. I need you to stop. I need you to pick that back up.
Yeah.
I need you to sound a little more interested, make that into a question statement. It's always good to have a producer with you when you're going through these things. I think that's also another key element.
Definitely. Right. Someone to coach you, guide you, give you
Yeah,
feedback in real time on like, let's do another take
it
of
can
that.
make a huge difference.
Well,
Yeah,
I think yeah, right. Unless you're very experienced at doing this and you can kind of be your own producer, it really helps to have someone listening in and, giving you feedback so you can improve in real time and really get the best stuff.
in my experience, the person that's writing a script has been the narrator, and they're not always the best,
Right.
but with me there coaching them along the way, it turned into
Mhm,
something great. Like, I don't mean to toot my own horn, but this is what I do, and this is what I love to do, and it's
mhm.
good to see results like that.
Yeah, no, for sure. But you make a good point, writing the script is one skill set. Narrating the script is another skill set. The person writing might not be a good narrator. The narrator might not have been able to write that script in the first place, right? All of which is to say that, I'm hoping our listeners are getting a sense of what's involved in putting this all together. And we haven't even really talked about, like, okay, once you've recorded the script and you have the sound bites from the interview, putting that all together and kind of weaving it together seamlessly and adding music and sound effects. I mean, that's a whole other thing, right? And I think our listeners maybe can, are better understanding now why most B2B brands have not are not yet doing these kind of podcasts, because they're significantly more work, as we said up front. Um, but I still think it's kind of like a dream of mine to be able to for some B2B brands to produce these kind of podcasts, because it doesn't matter how much work it takes and how hard it is. If you have the right team in place to do it, somebody like Conversa perhaps, or maybe another podcast agency, the end result, when done well, can absolutely be worth all the effort and the work and the extra cost, because you're going to end up with a product that just really stands out. Something that's as good as, again, if you have the right team in place, can be just as good as anything you're hearing on NPR. You know, the stuff that people really want to listen to just because it's well done and entertaining and also informative, but stuff that people look forward to is like, "Oh, cool, the next episode of such and such is coming out. I wanna know what's gonna happen in that story," right? Or if it's a standalone episode, like, "Cool, I'm gonna get a really cool story about some interesting person doing something interesting that's relevant to my work." That's what you can end up with. And again, my our point here, I think, is not that you should stop doing interview podcasts. You have to immediately start doing these kind of scripted narrative podcasts. It's really more that it's worth trying the scripted narrative route, just because the outcome can be really fantastic, if you do it well. So, Michael, final thoughts from you. What's a main takeaway maybe for our listeners?
Well, I don't have a main takeaway because I still want to continue this conversation. So I think
Oh,
there should
okay.
be
Go
a
ahead.
second part to this. But I think that you're hitting on something right there, because you said even if it's a standalone scripted narrative or if it's continuation, and one thing to think about is the suspense aspect. When you're listening, watching your next show, leaving off to continue the conversation somewhere else, maybe like we're doing here. I don't know. Maybe this will get cut out.
Hmm. Hmm.
But that's another element that's always fun to think about. So for main takeaways, I would say it's definitely going to be a unique and different product. Will take a lot of work, but I think it's going to be worth it to in your time to at least experience it once, to try, see how it goes, and then go from there.
Yeah, indeed. And I like what you're saying about doing a scripted narrative series where you're telling like one long story, but in like 3 or 4 episodes, and each episode ends with a bit of a cliffhanger, like what's going to happen next.
That was your idea. I just picked up on it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's funny though, but I hadn't been really thinking about it that way, because the model I have in mind, which I've mentioned several times, how I built this, those are standalone episodes. Each episode tells a discrete, self-contained story. But yeah, you could do, I mean, you don't have to stick to that. You could tell like a really kind of longer, complex story and break it up into several episodes and do like a continuous series like that. That could also be really cool. And hadn't thought about it until just now. But all right, anyway, we got to wrap this episode up. So Josh had to go. He had a recording to attend to. I'm sure Josh had a fantastic time in the podcast. Like we said, it was clearly one of the highlights of his entire life. So Josh, thank you for coming on. Michael, thank you very much for your time, for being here, for all the great insights. And listeners, thank you for listening to the show. If you're interested in scripted narrative podcast and you want to talk more about it, hit us up. Come to the website, conversa.com. That's CONN Versa. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find Michael on LinkedIn. Let us know your thoughts, or if you just want to talk about B2B podcasting generally, we're always happy to have a chat. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.